Good afternoon. I'm Erin Quinn, and we have the great opportunity today to sit here and have a discussion with Dr. Peter Lee, who's the Chairman Emeritus of the Department of Family Medicine and has been at USC for 52 years. And I currently serve as the Associate Dean for Admissions for the medical school, but my career in education really started with Dr. Lee over 23 years ago. And so what we're going to talk about Dr. Lee today and what brought him to USC, and start with the stories of the history of medicine at USC starting 52 years ago. So Dr. Lee, will you tell us a little bit about how you first came to USC and how that started and where you were when you...
Okay, I was at that time a young assistant professor of pharmacology at Stanford, which was where I had gone to medical school and had most of my residency. And one day, the then dean at USC came up to see me. That was Gordon Goodhart. And after we talked, he offered me a job, at least brought me down to USC to see about it. And the first thing that impressed me was that just a year before that was in 1954, and a year before that, the Board of Supervisors of LA County had decided to reimburse the university or the medical school for the teaching that they did at the Los Angeles County Hospital. And in those days, of course, it was long before we had a university hospital, and practically all of our clinical teaching was done at the county. And so Gordon had a little bit of money for the first time. And I think if we could show a cartoon, this is kind of the story of USC. If you'll let me know when you're focused on this, I'll tell you the caption. Because about the time I came to USC, this cartoon appeared in the New Yorker by Charles Addams, a famous cartoonist. The caption is, I imagine the crewman in this little boat is saying to his neighbor, pointing to this marvelous contraption next door, I imagine that's the University of Southern California. And I think this is kind of the story of our medical school, because our football teams are very wealthy and very successful. People around the country think USC is a very wealthy university. Mm-hmm. And one of the problems that has recurred starting from the very beginning and continuing today is that we don't have enough money. And we're not a wealthy medical school. We don't have any endowment to speak of. So this perception is an important thing to keep in mind. But so I came down, having been enticed by the prospect of the school having a little money to begin to develop with. And on the first visit, I met Dr. Thomas Brehm. Tom Brehm had just been appointed by the dean as professor and co-chairman of the Department of Medicine for education. And this was a ruse to try to get rid of the existing professor and chairman, Dr. Paul Starr, who was a very well-known thyroid expert, but was not interested in teaching. And obviously Dr. Starr was rather unhappy with this maneuver, and it took a couple of years before he finally left and Dr. Brehm became the chairman of medicine. Well, Tom Brehm was a marvelously impressive person. He was an excellent clinician, a very thoughtful, sound thinker, and a person who just inspired confidence in the environment that he was in at that time.
And did Dr. Brim have a real interest in education as?
Oh, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
Dr. Goodhart also did.
Oh, Dr. Goodhart did too, but Dr. Goodhart's job, like most deans' jobs, was to find enough money to keep things afloat.
Okay.
But
he was supportive, which is the key.
Oh, absolutely. The Dr. Goodhart ran the school in a way that was different from his predecessor, who was a marvelously colorful person named B.O. Ralston. And I had a number of encounters with Dr. Ralston, even though he had retired in about 1953. Ralston made the marvelous statement when he was accused of trying to raise money from the Santa Anita racetrack for the medical school, and some of his colleagues on the university campus suggested that this was tainted money, this gambling money. And Dr. Ralston said, the only trouble with tainted money is taint enough. But anyway, I was very naive at that time, and Gordon asked me to meet a number of the key senior faculty people, which I did. And I met Dr. Helen Martin and Dr. C.J. Byrne, who was chairman of surgery, part-time, Dr. Hugh Edmondson, who was professor of pathology and a great scholar in liver disease, and then a couple of the other basic scientists, John Mell in biochemistry and brilliant John Webb in pharmacology, which was the department that I would have gone into had I come to USC, and of course I did. So Webb was very impressive. The other people were a little bit, how should I put it? Well, they thought I was awfully young. I was then only 2 years out of my residency. And I didn't learn until many years later, when I was associate dean and had access to all of the dean's office files in the basement, that, and here I saw a file with my name on it. And I discovered that these people I was just having friendly chats with were my search committee. And they voted 4-3 to recommend that I be appointed. And that may have colored my feelings over the next 20 or 30 years about those three who said I shouldn't come. But at that time, the school had another benefit. They had received a gift from Dr. Seeley Mudd, very wealthy doctor who had been dean for a year or so during the war. And Dr. Mudd gave the university enough money so they could buy about 10 acres of property, literally across the street from the county hospital. And
was Zonal Avenue there?
Zonal Avenue was there, yeah. And so it was right on Zonal Avenue. And then during that same period, this was still before I came, because they had the lot and they had cleared it. It was mostly parking lots, except for a couple of leftover Army barracks buildings, which provided the housing for the medical school library. Well, they got money, and I haven't found out exactly how they did it, but they got money from the NIH to build a research building on this piece of property that they had bought. And that was the first building on the medical school campus. And for years it was called the Research Building. And then later on we decided to put Dr. Ralston's name on it because he engineered getting the grant before Gordon Goodhart came. So we had one building, and there were in fact research labs in the building, but the dean's office was there also in one corner on the ground floor. The school at that time was divided. The first 2 years were being taught on the University Park campus in the old science building. I don't even know if that still exists. Does it? Do you know? It was
If
right
that
across
building
from the
exists?
Hancock
I don't
Foundation.
know.
Anyway, the old science building. So they had their anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, biochemistry there. And then in their third year, they'd come over to the county hospital.
Okay.
And all they had were lockers in the basement of the county hospital. And until the research building was built, the dean's office was in the county hospital. So many looked upon us as a county medical school in those days. So the fact that we did practically all of our clinical teaching there made this arrangement with the county to provide funds a very logical procedure, both for the county and for the medical school, and very profitable for both. During that first year, one of my jobs, by the way, there were now how many? 19 associate deans and assistant deans. In those days, there was only one, and that was me. And we had a director of postgraduate education who later became an associate dean. And so the job of the associate dean, or initially assistant dean, included not only admissions and student affairs, but also participating in fundraising and also participating in building planning. And I didn't have too much to do with faculty appointments. That the dean held that as his responsibility, although I participated. So I had a lot of jobs. And I arrived during the 75th anniversary of the medical school, assuming that the school started way back in the 1980s when, before it folded after the Second World War. But 75th anniversary was beginning a fundraising campaign to build building for instructional purposes and more research space.
So the idea was they were going to move then first and second years over now.
Eventually to move this,
to our
bring
current
them all
campus.
to the health sciences campus, then called the medical campus. So part of the job was to go around the state talking to alumni, showing them pictures of this mythical building that they were contributing to. But with some matching funds and marvelous support from the USC medical alumni, we raised enough money to build the teaching building. And Dr. Mudd again contributed a lot of money, which was matched by federal funds for research, for the Mudd Research Building. So we got those going.
Peter, did they build the Mudd and the McKibben at the same time?
Yes.
I did, okay.
Yeah, they were built at the same time. And so while we were working on the design, design of what is now called the McKibben Building, we developed multidiscipline laboratories, which in that day those were in use really in only two other medical schools in the country, at Western Reserve and Harvard, and we borrowed some of their ideas. And we were able to talk all of our department heads into doing that because there wasn't enough money to build separate labs for teaching physiology, pharmacology, biochemistry, et cetera. We did have dissecting lab in the basement of that building, but all of the departments then had to share the teaching space. And there was another reason for doing that. We were hoping to improve the curriculum, as we've been doing ever since. And this required the departments to cooperate. And so that was a very helpful step. The other important thing during the Goodhart administration was that we put together a grant application to the Commonwealth Fund, which in those days gave money for medical education. And we had a plan to recruit additional basic science faculty and to put a little of that money into building so that we could complete the multidiscipline labs, which we knew the Commonwealth Fund would be attracted by because they liked innovation. And so we went back and visited with them at their headquarters in New York, and the dean was very persuasive. And so lo and behold, we got $300,000.
That was a lot of money.
In those days was a lot of money.
Right.
The following year, when I began to have a little something to do with the budget, I discovered that our entire budget from the university was $732,000 that year. That was 56, 57.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a big help and got us moving and was very good for morale also. Well,
but you realize the MDLs are our main teaching space now. I mean, that's what we use still
that's
to
right.
this day. So.
And the fact that they were so that is so multi-use, that they've been able to be adapted to rather different approach to laboratory teaching. But well, then the next event was that we were able, with this grant coming in, to recruit Irving Gordon as the professor of microbiology. In the past, microbiology, or was then called bacteriology, was based in the bacteriology lab of the county hospital. And it was run by Harold Pearson, a marvelous person. But
where in the hospital was that lab?
Well, it was on the second floor,
Second floor.
Down near where the library, right above the administration, in that vicinity.
Okay.
Anyway, but Harold Pearson and Marge Biddle ran that lab and did the teaching, sort of as a aside, because they were hired by the county.
How many students did you have at that time?
Oh, we had 68 in a class.
Students. Okay.
And the reason that magic number was chosen was that was all the locker space they had in the science building. So we could accommodate only that number. And it was a very nice number because in those days, the faculty and the administration could know every student.
Right.
And nowadays, with whatever it is,
168.
168, it keeps going up. It's impossible.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the dean had enough of deaning after I'd been there a couple of years, and knowing that Dr. Brem was there to provide leadership in a way that really inspired confidence, the dean decided to quit the dean's office and go into a residency in psychiatry. So he did that after I'd been there about a year. The university people were unwilling to appoint an interim dean, and that never was clear to me why they wouldn't do that. But they were very sensitive to the political aspects of our relationship with the medical community, because we were almost totally dependent on voluntary faculty in medicine and all the surgical specialties to do practically all of our teaching. In medicine, we had, in addition to Dr. Brem, we had Helen Martin, who ran the diabetes service, Pete Reynolds, who was then quite young, of course, but a tower of strength as a clinical teacher. And then they recruited Phil Manning to join the Department of Medicine, and then a year later, Phil became the director of postgraduate, which he has continued to do until he retired recently. Anyway, so they appointed this committee, which had some clinical faculty people on it and a couple of basic science people on it, and Dr. Brem and myself. Well, the other members
And it was the president of the university that appointed the committee, or the provost, or who?
Well, we didn't have a provost in
Okay.
those days. We had a vice president for academic affairs.
Okay.
And that was A.S. Robenheimer,
Okay.
Albert S. Robenheimer. Marvelous guy, very forbidding. He was a big, very red-faced Boer from South Africa, had gone to the University of Witwatersrand, and had a photograph of his alma mater on the wall of his office. It was the only picture in his office. And Roby was a very forceful administrator, tremendously committed to the educational mission of the university. And my favorite recollection of my encounter with him, after Dr. Brem and I were more or less running the medical school for the next 2.5 years, while we were looking for a real dean, I would have to go see Robenheimer all the time on issues relating to faculty or budget or something. And one day I was bemoaning my fate, and I said, you know, Roby, every time I turn around I have a new problem, and I keep bringing them to you. And he said, look here, Lee, if you didn't have problems, you wouldn't have a job. So that was
learned your lesson.
That was my guiding light for administrative life at USC. And so I have told many of my young colleagues that story to reassure them that they've got a job.
That's right.
Well, during that time with our interim administrative committee, we had some other funny events. We were trying to keep the school together and trying to recruit faculty.
Okay.
And I mentioned that we brought Irv Gordon in
Right.
as head of microbiology. And Irv made a tremendous difference to the school. And that is that he insisted on recruiting only absolutely top-level people. And the kind of people he wanted were people that he thought might someday get a Nobel Prize. Well, to get people like that to come to USC School of Medicine was a difficult job.
Right.
But he greatly, I guess nowadays you'd call it raising the bar. The standards that he set for his recruiting were very high. The other departments didn't quite meet that for a good many years, but this was a really important thing. And one of the issues I've mentioned, key people per, Tom Brem,
Right.
Robenheimer, and Irv Gordon, it is the appointment of the right people that makes the university, makes the medical school. And
That's true.
that's what's been so rewarding when we look back on 52 years.
What finally pushed them to hire a new dean?
Oh, they were looking for a dean.
Oh, they were looking
Oh, yeah.
for a dean.
But they just didn't want to appoint a single person as interim dean.
Okay, so it was a
Turned
school
out-
run by committee, so
Yeah,
to speak.
ostensibly.
Ostensibly.
But since Tom was chairman of the interim administrative committee, he really was the dean, and everybody knew that. One funny story about that I mentioned to Al Mathias on the parking lot, that during this interregnum that went until the fall of 1958, we were trying to keep things going. And after a class over in the county hospital one day, Dr. Helen Martin, a great clinician and great teacher and great person, but a very opinionated person, she came up to me and she said, Dr. Lee, I believe that you and Dr. Brem are trying to run this medical school. And,
Which you had to do. So,
anyway,
so
we,
who came next then?
then Clayton Loosely.
Clayton.
And we got him to come from the University of Chicago, where he was a virologist, an epidemiologist, physician as well, and had made very important advances in the study of influenza. Something attracted him about coming to USC. Part of it may have been the fact that his wife and Tom Brem's wife were
Good
roommates
friends. Oh,
when they
right.
were in nursing school.
Okay.
And so there was some connection already.
Mm-hmm.
And so he came, and we were delighted. And probably more than any one of the 10 deans that I've worked with, Clayton Loosley made the biggest difference in the medical school.
Really?
He was the one who insisted that we convert to a full-time faculty in clinical departments.
That was a huge difference.
That was moving from our total dependence on practicing physicians who volunteered their time and in a marvelous way. But for a school to develop as it needed to, we really needed a core of full-time people.
Right.
And he worked on that and was able to accomplish this particularly by finding and appointing people from outside USC. Our tradition had been in the past that the only people who were good enough were people who had been through our residency at
Mm-hmm.
the LA County. And so he changed that too. The sad part was that while he had all the right ideas and was very forceful, he was not very respectful of his superiors.
Oh.
And he had known the president by then was Norman Topping, who everybody remembers as having done a marvelous job improving the strength of the university as a whole. Well, he and Norm Topping had been in rather similar fields at the NIH many years
Oh.
before, and they developed a very definite dislike for each other.
Oh.
So while Clayton was really building the medical school in an excellent way, and Topping was building the university overall, the two of them really never got along. And if you and your boss don't get along, you know who's going to leave.
Right.
So on one
Absolutely.
occasion, Clayton, at a retreat where they were meeting with the Board of Trustees and others, and apparently Clayton had had a drink or two, because at that time, because of some disagreement, he called President Topping a major obscenity.
Oh.
And as Norm told the story later, somebody asked him, why did you fire Clayton? He said, well, I finally got fed up and I fired him when he called me this obscenity twice. So Clayton left, and he was replaced by our most colorful dean, which was Roger Eggeberg. Roger Olaf Eggeberg, of course, had been General MacArthur's personal physician in the South Pacific.
Right.
There's one of his favorite photographs is a picture of Roger walking ashore at Leyte Gulf with MacArthur.
Uh-huh.
And of course that was a totally staged thing because you didn't have to walk ashore.
Right.
The landing craft could have come up and laid down
The ramp.
the ramp, but he insisted on getting his feet wet. And so Roger had to go along with him.
Yeah.
And Roger had, after he got out of the Army, he became the chief of medicine and then whatever the title was in those days, chief of staff at the VA hospital in West LA.
Okay.
And from there, he was recruited to become medical director of the county hospital. And so he became very close to the medical school, and he was very popular and was in no way a kind of adversarial person the way Clayton was.
Mm-hmm.
So it didn't take long for him to be appointed dean. And under his regime, things began to come together.
So what year would this have been, more or less, would you say?
Let's see, 58 to about 64, so that would have been about 1964.
Okay.
And he was dean from 64 until the end of 68. when he was appointed Assistant Secretary for Health by
Oh.
President Nixon, who had just been elected
Okay.
in '68. So he left us and went to Washington at that point. But during that time, Roger was very good at talking to donors. And so we had the completion of several of our buildings during his regime. And the Norris Medical Library. And that was an interesting story because that was completed in around 1968 when Roger was still dean. And at that time, that was the peak of student activity against the Vietnam
Against the
War.
Right.
Well, we had no great problems with that. It was all quite peaceful, but Roger was very much offended when our student committee went to the donor of the Norris Medical Library, Kenneth Norris, Sr. Ken Norris made most of his money by manufacturing shell casings. And here these students went to our favorite donor and accused him of being a munitions maker and a war profiteer and all of these things that were the words that people used in those days. And Norris just brushed it off. He didn't even pay any attention, whereas Roger was panic-stricken that this was going to cause him to cancel his checks and not support us anymore. So during those
So that was a real build-up time then. A
yeah,
lot of building.
the campus was beginning to take shape then.
Okay.
And I forget the exact year in which these things were completed, but the Norris Medical Library and then the Keith Administration Building and the Mayer Auditorium, which was our first real auditorium, and then the Seaver Cafeteria, and in those days it had student dormitories above it. All of those things were built during this period, and so by then we had a campus that looked like a campus. And we continued to recruit faculty, and there was obviously a certain turnover of department chairs during this time.
Would this have been the time under Egeberg that when you were able to start really doing things with the curriculum and developing ICM, and was that about the same time?
Yeah, he did a very important thing. We had two different associate deans for medical education or curriculum in those days. First was Paul Saunders, a marvelous guy, who was a pharmacologist who died, and then Roger appointed Irv Gordon, a microbiologist. And for several years, we had committees going on talking about how to modify our curriculum. And one of the important things that we were learning was as a result of work that Phil Manning implemented. The idea, I think, came from Ed Steinbrook, who was then our chairman of psychiatry, marvelously articulate speaker, period. But they put together a little course for first-year students called An Introduction to the Doctor-Patient Relationship, the DPR as we called it. And we met over at the old Santa Fe Hospital, and then later we met at the old John Wesley Hospital, neither of which exists anymore, where students would interview patients, and then we had faculty teams of usually an internist or another type of clinician and a psychiatrist or psychologist. And these pairs would then have their little group of students talk about what happened in the interview.
And why did you go to the Santa Fe hospital rather than the county hospital? Do you know?
Well, it was more manageable.
Oh, okay.
And they welcomed us. And it was much quieter,
Okay.
easier to
To
do the
interview.
interviewing.
Okay.
And even though it wasn't a teaching hospital, there was teaching space there, which the county hardly ever had any space specifically for teaching.
Mm-hmm.
It was all patient care, and in those days,
All the wards were full.
we had a huge census. We would be running up until the time that Medicare came in, which would be in about 65. We would be running a census of over 2,400 patients
Wow.
every day. And it was just a huge volume of patients that needed to be cared for. So it was hard to find a place for a quiet interview for that type
Right.
of experience. Well, as a result of the doctor-patient course, we met a marvelous orthopedist named Lauren Stevens.
Mm-hmm.
Lauren was practicing in Arcadia at the time, but he was a musician, a photographer, an artist, an intellectual, different from the stereotype of the
Yeah.
orthopedic surgeon. And he participated in this course, and we then brought him on to some of the committees that, one of them that I was chairing, which was a committee on how to establish a tutorial relationship between faculty and students. And we combined that committee with another committee chaired by David Friedman,
Mm-hmm.
pediatrician, who was the first pediatrician I know who had a full-time social worker in his private practice office. Anyway.
So really forward-thinking people.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah.
And David was in charge of a committee to try to provide students with some sort of continuity of relationship of the student with the patient.
So were they actually brought on and paid like a stipend, or how did you arrange for them to leave? Did they have a morning a week that they came and just donated their time, or do you remember? It was
No,
donated
nobody
time.
was paid
No one was
anything.
paid, okay.
That is, none of the people
They had
who
the
were
interest.
who were in practice. They had the interest and the commitment, and were just willing to give up their time for that. And we had psychiatrists and basic scientists and clinicians on these committees. And so we combined David's committee and my committee into the tutorial/continuity committee, referred to as TUTCON for a couple of years. And that committee is what put together the idea of ICM.
Okay.
We didn't know what to call it. And then Dr. Brem looked at these plans and thought it was a great idea. He said, why don't you just call it Introduction to Clinical Medicine?
Which is what it is.
Which is what it is, and it has been that ever since. Well, during this period of Roger Eggenberg's deanship, he encouraged that kind of educational thinking and planning, and encouraged the involvement of many faculty in that activity. In 1961, we had opened what is now the McKibben building, the multidiscipline labs. So the basic science faculty had already had a few years of learning how to talk to each other and work with each other. Well, we then finally had a big faculty retreat. About 100 faculty went out to Apple Valley, to Roy Rogers Inn.
So what year would that have been?
That was in 1968.
1968, okay.
And Roger was still here then. And Roger came and sat through all the deliberations, and we finally came up where this group of 100 or so faculty people, in effect, voted to put this into action. And at that point, Roger stood up, and he was very big and had a big voice and a very commanding presence. And he said, I can see that this is a tremendously important thing for the school. the only way you can do it is to have enough money to make it work. And this involved the concept in the Introduction to Clinical Medicine that faculty people would work with a small group of students,
Right.
from 4 to 6 students,
So really mentoring.
for the whole year, emphasizing doctor-patient communication. And the plan was that in the second year, there would be a different set of mentors, primarily emphasizing traditional history taking and physical diagnosis, but based on this background of the students having really understood something about how to listen to patients.
Right.
And so he grasped all of that in the course of this 3-day meeting and said, I'm going to guarantee $250,000 a year to make this program work.
So that's where the ICM budget came from.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
And he created the ICM budget just by standing up and saying,
We'll do it.
this is a commitment. So that was really a
Which I think the budget's the same amount.
well,
40 years
that's
later.
the story of USC, right? But but while he himself didn't do the planning, he saw the importance of the planning and
Right.
made that commitment, which
That was really something that moved the university forward,
absolutely.
the medical school.
So while Loosely had brought in full-time faculty and moved the school in that way, having that faculty around working in a collegial way, then Egeberg took advantage of that situation and made the commitment to support it. So we're almost halfway through my deans.
So
So when Roger
that's,
left,
that's the new era of medical education right then. That's when it happened.
we started, and then Roger left, and Franz Bauer, who was his associate dean, was very quickly appointed as his successor. And it appeared to be quite a logical appointment because Franz was very active in working with various county clinics and hospitals during the period when the county, with federal support that started in Lyndon Johnson's administration, the county was doing a lot of work creating places where people who had no insurance could be cared for. And Franz had done a lot of work with those people. During Roger's term as dean also, this was during the time when the Watts riots of 1965 took place. And Roger went down and talked to community leaders in that area. And he and Bob Tranquada really got things moving that eventually resulted in the creation of the Martin Luther King Hospital. So that was a big event, but for most of us on the medical school campus, it was secondary. It wasn't what our primary work was.
And when Martin Luther King first opened, it was overseen both by physicians at our hospital and at UCLA.
Yeah.
So there was, both hospitals, or both medical schools worked together to
They were,
oversee that.
That's right. Well, when Franz Bauer was dean, the community influence was quite strong. And so from my personal standpoint, where this had its most important impact was the supporting of the development of our 8th floor medicine service, which we called Med Ocho, which was to provide a place in the county hospital where people from our East LA community could feel welcome. And so all of the staff were bilingual. We had community people who had offices on our wards who went out to the community, and whenever a patient came in, they would make sure that they understood what was happening and how things were going. It was we started that in about 1970.
And how long did that exist, Med Ocho?
Oh, about 10 years.
10 years.
And then various things happened with changes in leadership at different levels, county hospital, county in general, county health services, and the medical school. It was decided that that didn't need to continue in that form. And obviously, not everybody was happy about it because it
was before its time.
It gave special consideration to a particular part of our population. Well, anyway, but Dr. Bauer encouraged that development, and
he looked out at the community and was trying to meet the needs of the community.
Mm-hmm. So another one of the people who was tremendously influential in my career here was Bob Morandi. Bob was a clinician. He had a practice in Pasadena, but he had a very active interest in basic physiology. And way back in the early days, he and Helen Martin developed an artificial kidney.
Oh, okay.
And he finally decided, persuaded actually by Clayton Loosley, finally decided to quit his practice and come full-time into the Department of Medicine.
So that would have been the origination of dialysis. Correct?
Yeah, but he didn't pursue that as
okay.
But he was able to demonstrate that it was feasible.
Possible. Okay.
Yeah. Well, so he came to develop a section of clinical pharmacology within the Department of Medicine. And because I had started out with my appointment in pharmacology, and then in about 1960 I also joined the Department of Medicine and started being an attending on the wards. Mm-hmm. It made sense that I participate in that. And so we worked together for many, many years. And he was head of our hypertension clinic. Okay. And so the hypertension studies were part of what the clinical pharmacology group did. But what Bob contributed, which people don't think much about now, he implemented a computer-based prescribing service so that every prescription that was filled in the outpatient clinic at the county, every prescription went into a computer. So he was able, using an ancient, slow computer, but he was able to develop a means of tracking how doctors
prescribing habits.
Drugs. And so our concentration for quite a while was on physicians' prescribing habits. Mm-hmm. And it would be nice if we could say that we were able to use that effectively for education. It was most helpful really to the Medi-Cal program, because they could monitor doctors who prescribed unusually large amounts of certain drugs, right, and check up and see what was going on. So in a sense it was kind of disciplinary, yeah, but and cost control. But nonetheless, that collection of data has been used ever since by the Medicare drug program.
Right.
Well, anyway, so that was Bob Morandi. And then later, when he retired from medicine, Joe Vandermeulen appointed him as assistant vice president for health affairs, to continue working on the county-based data collection. And so he did that for a number of years after he stopped actively running the service. Well,
so who came next?
Next was Alan Mathias. And that's another story. Al Mathias was an associate dean under Franz Bauer.
Okay.
So we had a series of internal appointments. And during Mathias's time, which would have been in the 70s primarily. Let me just look at my
Look
notes
at
and
those
see
days.
his
Because
dates.
Matthias, I came in 1981. Matthias was dean at that point.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that was an important thing for us because Mathias was the dean who, following the 74 to 85, so he was dean for
Okay.
11 years.
Right.
He was the dean who created the separate Department of Family Medicine. But there's a little background to that. During the time we were running Med Ocho in the hospital, our chief resident was Sam Matheny.
Okay.
And during his last year of residency, he also found time to go to UCLA School of Public Health and get a Master of Public Health. And then he decided that, having been influenced by Dr. Fred Elliott down at Rancho Los Amigos, that maybe we ought to think about family medicine. This was a rather new specialty in those days. And so Sam began developing preceptorships in the community for family medicine with family physicians who were out there and were well trained.
So there were a few family physicians that had
There
already
were a
been-
few already.
Okay.
Mhm. And he monitored them. In the 1978 was the last year in which a person could take his specialty boards in family practice without having had a residency.
Okay.
From 79 on, you had to have
Have a
3 years of residency in family medicine. They called it family practice. They're calling it family medicine pretty much across the board now. So Sam became board certified in family medicine. He started these community preceptorships. And during that period, he got the idea that we could start a residency, and he got a sympathetic ear from the Presbyterian Intercommunity Hospital in Whittier. And for some reason, they were willing to support
Put the money
a
forward.
family practice
Yeah.
residency.
Yeah.
So it didn't cost the university any money except for the time of our full-time people who went out there. During that period, the county was paying for 5 or 6 full-time faculty people who were working in the department then called the Department of Family and Preventive Medicine. And then a couple of bad things happened. After Proposition 13, which was passed in the late 70s, but it really had its impact in the early 1980s, where the counties, every county in the state practically went broke because they didn't have the progressive increase in property tax that the Howard Jarvis imposed on the world. And so the county had to stop paying all of our full-time faculty. So we had another bubble burst. And by this time, Brian Henderson had come as chairman of the Department of Family and Preventive Medicine, and he began very quickly to develop an outstanding research department, attracting just incredibly fine people, Tom Mack and Malcolm Pike and Leslie Bernstein, Ronald Ross, the late Ron Ross. Well, in the course of doing that, he realized that having a division of family medicine wasn't quite fitting his goal of preventive medicine.
Right.
In the old days, when when it was called community and family medicine, or family and community medicine, there was a much closer relationship, but he moved preventive medicine in a totally new direction. And in the course of that, Dr. Matheny, who was in charge of the family medicine program, found himself disagreeing with Dr. Henderson on certain basic issues like budget.
Right.
And just like loosely on topic, when your boss doesn't like you. So Henderson fired Matheny in about 1981. And Sam went to be a very active faculty person at the Santa Monica Hospital Family Practice Residency, which was one of the oldest and most prestigious of the residencies. Also with Sam gone, Brian asked me to, because by then I had moved over into family medicine. Oh, and one amazing thing happened. Speaking of collegiality, Jack Bethune, who was then chairman of the Department of Medicine, donated my county item, my position, money, to family medicine. And because I was spending more time there, I was still attending on the wards, but my main educational work was within the family medicine group. So that was an amazing thing to do. And so then Henderson appointed me as the person in charge of the undergraduate, the medical student component of family medicine, and Bob Martin, who was by that time the director of our residency at Whittier, as head of the residency programs. So basically we had preceptorships for the medical students, and that was about it. And we had one residency.
Because at that point we still didn't have a required rotation in
That's
family
correct.
medicine.
That came some years later.
Right.
That was actually not until after we had actually become a department.
Right.
Well, then Henderson took another step, and he had a very good relationship with Alan Mathias. So we went to the dean, and he said, I'd like you to get these people out of my department and give them a new department. And so Dean Mathias got his department chairs to agree to that and created a new department.
And so that was in 1981?
That was 83.
83.
Yeah. And in 83, we became a freestanding department. And Brian Henderson and I divided up all of the positions that we had from university and, in my case, county.
Right.
And so I got a batch, and he kept the ones he wanted. So we started off, and I would say that there were a number of things that we were able to do with rather limited budgetary resources. But we worked for a long time. We'd been working with the area health education centers, which was a strange kind of
Federal
boondoggle,
funding,
federal money
Yeah.
to support community programs, and medical schools could participate in that. And that brought us into contact with people in the community. But it also provided an opportunity, because there was a statewide coordinator for the AHEC in California. And they were moving in a direction of, again, wanting to support training of Hispanic family physicians.
Right.
Because then, even worse than now, there was a underrepresentation of Hispanic doctors, and particularly in family medicine. So we persuaded them to give us a little planning money, and we persuaded the White Memorial Medical Center, which of course was a Seventh-day Adventist Loma Linda related hospital, to look into the possibility of doing it. We hired a consultant, great experienced person, Sandy Bloom, who had been the director at Santa
Right.
Monica. And we recruited 2 young family physicians, Luis Samaniego and Hector Flores. And the 4 of us worked together to plan a program, and particularly the wisdom and overall advice from Sandy Bloom was just invaluable, but the intelligence and energy of Louis and Hector, and they're still there, and they are still co-directors. I call them Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside because Hector is out doing the political
That's
work,
right.
and Louis is doing the educational work.
Right.
But they work marvelously well together.
And
they
this next spring will be the 20th anniversary of the first graduating class.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So,
And so that was one of the contributions that was really quite important.
absolutely.
And about the same time, we got some additional AHEC money to start a residency in the central city of Los Angeles at California Hospital. And we got that one going with bribing the hospital with this upfront money. It wasn't much, maybe $50,000, but it made them feel as if maybe there's money out there somewhere. And of course, they've struggled with budgetary problems right along. But here they are,
Right in the inner city.
about the same age as the White Memorial Program, also in the inner city. And for years, they primarily had a patient base that is sort of Medicaid
Right.
base. And as a result, their reimbursements aren't very great.
Yeah.
And
We should talk a little bit about some of the faculty that came into the Department of Family Medicine, and kind of your role as the guiding light or the mentor to so many faculty members in family medicine, and how the department evolved in that time.
Yeah, the first appointment I made was Alan Abbott, who had come down from his practice in Idlewild, country practice, to be on our faculty at PIH, at Presbyterian in Whittier. But very quickly I realized that we needed him. And so we brought him in. He was the first full-time person, and what he did was to create the support through the whole medical school for a required clerkship, third-year clerkship in family medicine for the medical students.
I helped write that grant with Alan. That was fun.
And then to work in our clinics, which were county-related comprehensive health centers, that was where we first brought Louis Samaniego and Maureen Strom. And Louis, of course, went to become head at the White Memorial, and Maureen to be the director at California Medical Center. And before that, Maureen took over as the head of Introduction to Clinical Medicine for a number of years. So she's had a very important career within the department. The main thing is not so much mentoring. You find people who are really good and then just tell them to go and do their work. And then later, just a couple of years later, you joined us as the departmental administrator and completed your Ph.D. after you had been working with us, which was, I
was
remember
all
that
but
was
dissertation
that was
when I came.
a big day, yeah.
Yeah.
And then when a couple of years later, in 1987 and 88, this was now when Bob Tranquada was dean. Bob thought that availability of funds for educating doctors about AIDS and how to take care of patients with AIDS. This is
Late
we
80s.
didn't call it HIV in those
No.
days. He thought it ought to be done by family medicine. That distressed John Leadham, who was head of infectious disease, and did a marvelous job of creating really the first and the best AIDS clinic in the country in a county
Right.
hospital.
5P21.
5P21, fifth floor of the old outpatient
Right.
building. And he didn't get all the support he should have had from other departments, but that's another story.
Yeah.
But
Well, don't you think, looking back though, too, there was so much change happening at once, and the disease changed, so who was involved changed.
Yeah.
I mean, when it first happened, there were no women affected, and then the women started being affected, and so like Sandy Levine and Andrea Kovacs and different people got involved,
Right.
but it was evolving so quickly.
that's right. And there was quite a bit of money available for different kinds of things.
Right.
Leadham got funding for clinical trials. Sandy Levine got funding for her research in the lymphoma-related HIV problems. And Andrea Kovacs was working primarily with children and families. So that there are all these different
Yeah.
pockets of
Aspects, yeah.
emphasis. And ours was purely educational through the AIDS Education and Training Center program. And we were fortunate enough to get good collaboration from our colleagues at UCLA, at UC Irvine, and at King Drew, so that we had and also to some extent UC San Diego, but that came a little later.
Right.
So we had 5 medical schools working together on this educational program, and every year, so this will be our 10th year,
Right.
we have received very nearly $1 million a year for this program.
Well, it's been more than 10 years now.
No, we started in
88, 89?
88.
Yeah, so 20.
20 years.
20
yeah,
years.
20 years.
Yeah.
Boy,
Yeah.
keep forgetting where we are now.
When you,
Well,
we should-
I just want to
make
come
a
back
point,
to the
yeah.
people,
yeah,
because once we got into that, we needed to recruit family physicians who were competent in AIDS care. And by definition, these had to be young people just out of their residencies who had shown an interest and learned something about it. And so that is what brought us Peter Katsafrakis, who had been to UC San Diego and then at Santa Monica Hospital residency, and Ann Kalsa, who had come from USC Medical School, where I had met her but didn't really know her. And she had a residency at San Bernardino County, and then we got her to come back. Well, these two people, when they started working and teaching in John Leadham's and Fred Sattler's AIDS clinic in 5P21, John totally changed his point of view. One day we were at a meeting and he said, you know, I really want to express my gratitude. He says, Peter Katsafrakis is the best doctor in our clinic. This includes all of my faculty in infectious disease, and he's better than any of them. And the same with Ann Kalsa, who came in a couple of years, a year or two later.
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting thing when you talk about the faculty that you've appointed and how they've moved, because in the first place, everybody that I can remember having appointed to the faculty is currently still in an academic position, not all of them here. And they didn't just pass through and go back into practice again. And as far as USC is concerned, we're sort of taking over the education department in the dean's office. because first you went over there
Peter
as
and I went at the same time in
as
1993. Right.
Associate Dean for Admissions, and Peter Katsiprakis as Associate Dean for Student Affairs. And then later, Alan Abbott was appointed Associate Dean for Curriculum, and he was responsible for bringing faculty together in the old-fashioned collegial way so that our so-called new curriculum that started in 2001 was implemented with full faculty support. And then we've now got, as Assistant Dean for Student Affairs, Pam Schaff, who up until this year was running the ICM program and doing a beautiful job with that. So we've got Katsiprakis and Quinn and Abbott. And then Abbott had to get another job because when Dr. Phil Manning retired as Associate Dean for Postgraduate, excuse me,
Alan's
they appointed Alan to that. So he's got two full-time jobs over there in education.
Gets them coming in and after.
That's right.
So.
And while Dr. Katsiprakis has now left the university to become vice president of the National Board of Medical Examiners, he is staying in a quasi-academic spot anyway. So that's been very rewarding.
When you look back, what's probably the most rewarding to you, the faculty that you've appointed, and or would it be the creation of ICM?
I'd say those two things. The faculty that I've appointed and have learned from all these years, and being a significant part of the creation of ICM, which has, as you say, continued. And I don't know, I haven't talked to you about this specific question, but for years, students applying to USC would say the most important thing that attracts them to USC is ICM.
It's still true.
It's still true.
It's still true.
I'm glad.
It's true to this
glad
day,
to hear that.
So. And it's our strength. It really is our strength.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that students, within the first week of medical school actually get to interact with patients, it sets the tone for what they're going to be doing, and the fact that they're now in a profession. Yeah. They're not just in school.
No, I felt very strongly that that was a crucial thing, that this is why they're in medical school, so you should start with that right away. Right. And that's a really important point.
Well, who was your favorite dean? That's a really political question.
Yeah, that's a political question, because each dean, well, I wasn't particularly close to Franz Bauer, so, but each dean had a special attribute. Bob Trenquada, for example, was a student in my pharmacology class, the first class I taught after I finished my residency at Stanford. And Bob Trenquada and Dan Michel, who was just recently retired as chairman of OBGYN, were in that class. So I've had that kind of connection for 50 years, 60 years. Yeah. And so he's one kind of favorite. And because Alan Mathias created the department, he's another kind of favorite. Roger Eggeberg was such a charming and delightful person that he's another kind of favorite. And Clayton Loosley, who was a good friend and a driving spirit to move the medical school, was another kind of favorite. And then, because he was truly my mentor at USC, Tom Brem was yet another. So I think I would have to give
a great group.
Comparable awards to that whole group of deans. most recent years, one of the things that Louise asked us to reflect upon is, what are you doing in your retirement?
Right.
And right now I'm not doing much, but...
Well, you came and taught PPM, too, after
well, that was,
retirement,
yeah, I was
so-
just going to say that I retired in 1995, and a couple of years before that I had stopped teaching ICM because I wasn't any longer seeing patients, and it didn't seem to be quite authentic to be doing that. But I continued teaching in the third-year clerkship
Right.
Up until about 2 years ago. And that wasn't particularly demanding, but it was something that I had to work at and to keep up. And then the new curriculum, starting in the fall of 2001, introduced what is now called the Professionalism and Practice of Medicine. And in those first years, it was something called the Mentorship Program.
We didn't quite have a name for it.
and you and I were co-mentors
That's right.
for that first year class in 2001. And then the way the rules worked, I continued with that class during their second year, and you had to jump back
Right.
and pick up a new class. But that was because it was a totally new program. We were inventing it as we went along. And many of us who were mentors were also participating in the planning. And then most of my weekends during that year were spent
Reading
preparing
and
for
Monday
the Monday
afternoon.
afternoon session with the
Yeah.
students.
Yeah.
It
They
was
were a great group.
it was a great group. It was very rewarding, and it was a lot of work. And when my second year ended in 2003, I decided that I didn't quite have the energy to do it again, and so I discontinued that. But yeah, that was an important post-retirement activity, by far the most important post-retirement thing I've done. The totally recreational, not anything to do with the school, except that we organized an Emeritus faculty reading group, which has been going on for about 10 years now. And we meet once a month. And Helen Martin was a member of that group, and she died just 2 days short of her 100th birthday. And at the last session before that, she was still just as sharp as could be and full of wit and humor and opinion. She had been.
That hadn't changed.
And she was a delightful member. And then the other folks, we used to meet at her retirement place. And then after she died, we were meeting at my home.
Good.
And since most of the members are from the east side rather than the west side, we have only one commuter who comes over from Mar Vista or someplace. But that maintains a kind of spiritual tie with the faculty, because these were people, most of whom, not all, I worked with in one way or another. And some were voluntary faculty and some were full-time. But that's been a great experience.
Well, I know you, and I know myself, and I know we can talk forever, but we've
We are
used up our time.
overtime.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Well, we've used our hour.
we certainly
Well,
have.
is there anything else that I didn't tell you? You
I
were
think-
supposed to ask me why I wanted to be a doctor.
Well, why did you want to be a doctor, Dr. Lee?
That's a funny story, because people don't believe it. My father was a doctor, and in Palo Alto, and his home phone number was in the phone book, and he would get calls
All the time.
all the time, day or night. He was on call. We didn't call it on call, it was just being a doctor. And frequently at the dinner table, the telephone was on the dinner table so he could talk to patients. And so obviously I had some understanding of what a medical life was like, a practice life was like. But when throughout my life in elementary school, I had marvelous, inspiring teachers, and in high school, the same. And also as an undergraduate in college, the same. So when I was in high school, I was so impressed with several of the teachers that I decided I wanted to be a teacher. And when I was a senior, my chemistry professor, Lawrence J. Fuller, took me aside and he said, "Pete, you're crazy." I said, "You ought to be a doctor." And I said, "Well, I never thought of that." And so I was talked into entering a pre-med program by my high school chemistry teacher.
There you go.
So that's the story.
There's always somebody who's, in some cases you think it'd be the parents, but it's somebody else who says something that it triggers it. That's what I've found with students over all these years.
Yeah.
Somebody else that was
but
influential.
that is a true story.
Oh.
Well, thank you very much for putting up with all of this.
Well, this was fun. No, well, I love the story, so.
Okay, now do we say goodbye to the
Yeah.
camera?
Thank you. We're done.